The whiskey bottle trembled in Sheriff Matthew Harris's weathered hands as he stared out the window of his office in Virginia City. The golden plains stretched endlessly before him, dotted with grazing cattle and the occasional wisp of dust from passing riders. He hadn't touched a drop in 3 days, his longest stretch of sobriety since that fateful night 6 months ago when he'd arrested his own brother John for gunning down a family of homesteaders in cold blood. The morning sun cast long shadows across the floorboards as Matthew traced his fingers over the telegram that had arrived at dawn. News of John's prison break had spread like wildfire across the territory, along with rumors of Confederate deserters gathering under his banner. The thought made Matthew's throat burn with familiar thirst, but he forced himself to focus on the dried ink before him instead of the bottle's tempting comfort. Deputy David Young burst through the door, his boots leaving muddy prints on the worn wooden floor. "Sheriff, Mr. Wright's ranch hands just rode in from the north pasture. They spotted a group of riders moving through Miller's Canyon, at least 30 men, heavily armed." Matthew's hand instinctively moved to his gun belt as he straightened his badge with trembling fingers. Grace Lewis, the town's schoolteacher, watched from across the street as Matthew emerged from his office. She alone knew the depths of his struggle with the bottle, having found him unconscious behind the saloon more times than she cared to count. But she'd also seen glimpses of the man he used to be. The one who'd brought law to Virginia City's wild streets before John's betrayal shattered his world. The town council had gathered in the lobby of Victoria King's Hotel, their faces grave as Matthew entered. Andrew Wright, the largest cattle rancher in the territory, spoke first. "My men counted Confederate uniforms among the riders. If John Harris is leading them, we need to prepare for the worst. He knows this town, knows its weaknesses." The words hung heavy in the air, weighted with unspoken accusations about Matthew's own weakness. Rebecca Young, the doctor's wife, worked silently behind the group, preparing bandages and medical supplies. She'd treated Matthew's wounds after the shootout with John, both physical and spiritual, watching helplessly as he turned to whiskey instead of healing. Now she caught his eye and gave him a small nod of encouragement, remembering the strong man who'd once saved her husband from a mob of angry miners. Hannah Wright paced nervously by the window, her fingers twisting the fabric of her skirt. As Andrew's daughter, she'd grown up alongside the Harris brothers, watching their relationship deteriorate after their father's death left them on opposite sides of the law. "Matthew," she said softly, "John won't stop until he's destroyed everything you've built here. You know that better than anyone." The memories flooded back. John standing over the dead homesteaders, his gun still smoking as he laughed in Matthew's face. "They wouldn't sell, brother. Sometimes progress requires a firm hand." The sound of Matthew's own handcuffs clicking around his brother's wrists. The look of pure hatred in John's eyes as he was led away to the territorial prison in Santa Fe. Abigail Harris, Matthew's wife of 15 years, had left him 3 months after John's arrest, unable to bear the shame or watch her husband's slow descent into the bottle. Her last words echoed in his mind. "You're becoming everything you once fought against." The truth of it had driven him deeper into drink, until Grace and Rebecca had finally intervened, forcing him to face his demons. The council argued about evacuation plans and defensive positions, but Matthew barely heard them. His focus had shifted to the bottle sitting on his desk across the street, and the choice it represented. He could surrender to its embrace one last time, numb himself to the coming storm, or he could finally become the man his town needed him to be. The man he'd once been before John's shadow fell across his badge. Deputy Young's voice cut through Matthew's thoughts. "Railroad telegram says the nearest military patrol is 2 days out at best. We're on our own." The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Matthew, waiting to see if their sheriff would rise to the challenge or crumble under its weight. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap, heavy with the fate of Virginia City and all its souls. Andrew Wright cleared his throat, his weathered face etched with concern. "Those deserters won't just take the town. They'll use it as a base to carve out their own territory. Every ranch and homestead for 50 miles will fall under their control. John Harris knows enough about local law enforcement to make it work too. He was almost sheriff himself before." He trailed off, shooting Matthew an apologetic glance. Matthew's fingers traced the smooth glass of the whiskey bottle, his calloused skin catching on the paper label. Through the window, he watched dust devils dance across Virginia City's main street, carrying tumbleweeds and forgotten promises. The same wind that had carried his brother John away to war now threatened to bring him back with destruction in his wake. 2 days, Matthew muttered, finally pushing the bottle away. The glass scraped across his desk with a sound like distant thunder. Andrew's right. John won't just take the town. He'll use everything he learned from our father, everything he learned wearing this badge, to build something worse than what we fought against in the war. Deputy Young shifted uncomfortably, his boots leaving scuff marks on the worn floorboards. The merchants are already talking about paying them off, Sheriff. Michael Turner's loading his wagon now, says he'd rather lose his stock than his life. The young deputy's face showed the strain of watching their community unravel, thread by thread. Matthew stood, his chair groaning in protest. The familiar weight of his gun belt settled around his hips as he buckled it on, each notch in the leather marking a year of service and loss. Get word to the outlying ranches. Anyone who can't make it to town before sundown tomorrow needs to head for Santa Fe. The rest, he paused, studying the faces of the men before him. The rest will stand with us. Andrew Wright nodded grimly, already reaching for his hat. I'll round up every able hand from my spread. Victoria and the other women can organize supplies at the church. We'll need food and medical provisions if it comes to a siege. The rancher's practical mind was already mapping out the logistics of their resistance. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as Matthew made his rounds. He passed Hannah's boarding house, where she stood in the doorway with arms crossed, her gray-streaked hair catching the light. She'd been like a mother to both Harris brothers after their own passed, and the pain in her eyes mirrored Matthew's own. You knew this day would come, Hannah said softly as Matthew approached. Ever since you put those shackles on him, I've seen it eating at you. The bottle won't wash away what needs to be done. Her words carried the weight of years watching Matthew struggle with his demons, both liquid and familial. Matthew leaned against the porch post, feeling the rough wood through his shirt. John was always the better shot, the stronger rider, but he never understood what the badge meant. That law isn't just about power, it's about protection. The words tasted bitter in his mouth, memories of his brother's trial rising like bile. In the distance, a rider appeared on the horizon, kicking up a trail of dust that stretched like a serpent across the plains. Matthew's hand instinctively moved to his gun as the figure grew larger, but he recognized the horse's gait before the rider's face came into view. It was Grace Turner, Michael's daughter, her dress stained with trail dust and her face flushed with urgency. "Sheriff," she called out, reining her horse to a stop. "Confederate riders at the North Fork. They're burning homesteads and pressing men into service. Join them or die, they say. Rebecca Miller's place is already ash." Grace's voice cracked as she delivered the news, her hands trembling on the reins. Matthew straightened, his decision crystallizing like frost on a winter morning. "Hannah, get word to Victoria at the church. We need every spare bed ready." He turned to Grace, his voice steady despite the storm building in his chest. "How many riders did you see?" "At least 30. Maybe more coming." And Sheriff Grace hesitated, her young face aged by fear. "Your brother was leading them. He had your father's old cavalry saber strapped to his saddle." The mention of their father's sword, a relic of an older, more honorable war, sent a chill through Matthew's bones. John hadn't just come back to destroy his brother's town. He'd come to destroy everything their father had ever stood for. The time for drowning sorrows was over. Virginia City would either stand or fall on the strength of its sheriff's resolve. Matthew watched Grace ride toward the church before turning his attention to the sheriff's office. His hands shook as he unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk. Not from fear, but from the gnawing need that had been his constant companion these past years. The whiskey bottle sat untouched where he'd left it 3 days ago, its amber contents mocking him. With deliberate force, he grabbed the bottle and smashed it against the back wall, watching the glass and liquid scatter like his shattered family bonds. The office walls, weathered by plains wines and countless storms, held wanted posters that told the story of his failure as both lawman and brother. John's face stared back at him from the oldest poster, dated 5 years ago when Matthew had found him standing over David Cooper's body at the Lucky Strike mine. Their father's lessons about justice and duty had never sat well with John, who'd always wanted more than honest work could provide. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Virginia City's main street as townspeople hurried to secure their businesses and homes. The livery stable's owner, Michael Walsh, was already organizing men to move horses to the hidden canyon north of town. Sheriff Matthew Harris stared at his trembling hands, willing them to steady as he poured another drink. The amber whiskey sloshed against the glass, betraying his weakness. Through the grimy window of his office in Virginia City, he watched dust devils dance across the dry prairie, their spiraling forms like the ghosts that haunted his dreams. His brother John's face appeared in his mind. Not the hardened killer he'd become, but the young man who'd once worked alongside him on their father's ranch. The late summer heat pressed down on the town like a heavy blanket, making tempers short and tongues loose. Rebecca Young, the schoolteacher who'd been trying to help Matthew stay sober, found him slumped at his desk. Her disappointment was evident in her green eyes, but she said nothing as she placed a fresh pot of coffee before him. They both knew what was coming. John Harris and his band of Confederate deserters had been spotted less than 2 days' ride from town. David Wright, Matthew's deputy, burst through the door with news that made the sheriff's blood run cold. 3 ranches to the north had been raided, their cattle stolen, and buildings burned. The raiders left a message carved into a fence post. "Brother dear, your walls won't hold." Matthew recognized John's flair for the dramatic, remembering how his younger brother had always possessed a poet's soul before the war twisted it into something dark. The town council gathered in Andrew King's general store, their faces grim as Matthew laid out what they knew. Victoria Lewis, the widow who owned the largest ranch outside town, spoke first. "Those deserters aren't just after revenge, they want territory. My foreman spotted them marking boundaries, setting up camps. They're planning to stay." Her words confirmed Matthew's worst fears about his brother's intentions. Grace Harris, Matthew's wife of 15 years, watched from their bedroom window as he practiced his draw in the backyard. His hands were steadier now, 3 days sober, but the craving clawed at his insides like a wild animal. She remembered when John had first returned from the war, changed and dangerous. Matthew had been forced to arrest him after finding 3 dead men in the saloon, their blood mixing with spilled beer on the wooden floor. The first attack came at dawn, a probing raid that tested Virginia City's defenses. Michael Young, the blacksmith, took a bullet in the shoulder before the raiders retreated. Matthew recognized his brother's tactics. John had always excelled at chess, setting up his pieces methodically before striking. The sheriff organized volunteers into patrols, knowing the next move would be more calculated, more deadly. Hannah Wright, the town's only doctor, worked tirelessly to prepare for what was coming. She converted the church into a makeshift hospital, stockpiling bandages and medicines. Matthew watched her efficiency with admiration, remembering how she'd tried to save their father after John's bullet had torn through his chest during the prison escape 2 years ago. The old man's last words still echoed. "Save your brother, Matt. He's still in there somewhere." The plains around Virginia City became a chessboard of movement and counter-movement. John's men probed the town's weaknesses, while Matthew's volunteers strengthened defenses. Abigail King, Andrew's daughter, reported seeing strange lights at night, signal fires in a pattern only the Harris brothers would recognize from their childhood games. Matthew knew his brother was taunting him, daring him to remember who they'd been before everything shattered. Rebecca found Matthew standing at their father's grave one evening, his flask untouched in his pocket. She placed a gentle hand on his arm as he spoke of happier times, of teaching John to ride, of summer nights spent naming constellations. "He's planning something big," Matthew said, his voice rough with emotion. "John never could resist a grand gesture. He'll want the whole town to witness whatever comes next." The setting sun painted the gravestones blood red, a warning written in light. The cattle raids increased, strategic strikes that drew defenders away from Virginia City. Matthew recognized the pattern too late. John was isolating the town, cutting off supply lines and wearing down resources. Each raid left another message. Fence posts carved with poetry, biblical verses twisted into threats. When Abigail discovered her father's store had been broken into, nothing was stolen. Instead, they found a childhood photograph of the Harris brothers pinned to the wall with a cavalry saber. The broken night silence shattered as shots rang out near the livery stable. Matthew stumbled from his office, fighting the familiar tremor in his hands as he reached for his gun belt. 3 of John's men had set fire to the hay storage, the flames already licking hungrily at the wooden walls. Through the smoke, he spotted Rebecca leading frightened horses to safety, her face streaked with soot as she worked to save the animals that were Virginia City's lifeline to the outside world. Behind the chaos, Matthew caught a glimpse of a familiar silhouette. David, John's second-in-command. A man who'd fought alongside them both in the war before choosing to follow the darker path. Their eyes met across the burning yard, and David tipped his hat with mocking civility before melting into the shadows. The message was clear. This was just another move in John's elaborate game of chess. Grace appeared at Matthew's side, medical bag in hand, already treating burns and smoke inhalation among the townspeople who'd rushed to fight the fire. Her quiet strength steadied him as she worked, reminding him why he'd chosen this path of redemption over the bottle. "Your brother's trying to break us piece by piece," she said softly, binding a ranch hand's injured arm. "But he doesn't understand what holds this town together." The dawn revealed the full extent of the damage. Half the livery destroyed, crucial winter feed reduced to ashes. Victoria, the livery owner's widow, stood amid the wreckage with steel in her spine. "We'll rebuild," she declared, already organizing the remaining hay into careful rations. Matthew watched the townspeople rally around her, sharing what they had, making plans to send riders to distant ranches for help. His hands still shook, but now from anger rather than withdrawal. Abigail discovered the next message later that morning, carved into the church door. Exodus 12:29. At midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt. The biblical threat made Matthew's blood run cold. John had always been the scholarly one, twisting scripture to his own ends. The Reverend's daughter Hannah stood reading it, her young face troubled. "He's not just threatening you anymore, Sheriff," she observed. "He's challenging God himself." As the town gathered for an emergency meeting, Matthew studied the faces before him, ranchers and merchants, women and children, all looking to him for protection. He remembered John's words from their last confrontation. "A town is only as strong as its weakest link, little brother." His gaze fell on Michael, the saloon owner who'd been his enabler for so many years. Something shifted in Michael's expression. Guilt, perhaps, or resolution. Wind howled across the plains that evening, carrying the scent of coming winter. Matthew stood at his office window, watching riders patrol the town's perimeter. A telegram had arrived from Laredo, warning of Confederate deserters gathering in force, led by a man matching John's description. The pieces were falling into place. His brother wasn't just seeking revenge, he was building an army, aiming to carve out his own kingdom in the lawless territories. Andrew, his young deputy, brought reports of similar raids on nearby ranches. "They're forming a noose," the boy said, spreading a map across Matthew's desk, cutting off every route except the old Santa Fe Trail. The pattern was familiar. John had used the same strategy during the war, isolating enemy positions before striking. But this time, Matthew had something his brother hadn't counted on. A town full of people who'd rather die than surrender to tyranny. In the growing darkness, Matthew finally surrendered to an old ritual, removing the flask from his desk drawer. But instead of opening it, he walked to the horse trough outside and poured the whiskey into the water. The act felt like cutting away a piece of himself, but as he watched the amber liquid dissipate, he knew it was time to face his demons clear-headed. John was coming, and the storm he'd bring would require every ounce of strength Matthew possessed. The dawn brought riders from the south. 3 ranch hands with fresh wounds and haunted eyes. They'd escaped John's men by hiding in a dry creek bed while their homestead burned. Matthew listened to their accounts, each detail confirming his fears. His brother wasn't just raiding anymore. He was building an army, offering Confederate deserters and outlaws a chance to claim their own piece of territory through force. Andrew worked the telegraph, sending warnings to every settlement within reach. But the responses grew fewer each day as lines were cut and stations went silent. Virginia City stood like an island in a rising tide of lawlessness, its citizens watching the horizon with growing unease. Matthew knew they'd need more than warnings to survive what was coming. In the mercantile, Hannah sorted ammunition while her daughter Rebecca helped townspeople stockpile supplies. The widow had turned her store into a makeshift armory, her ledger now tracking bullets instead of beans. "Your brother's men took everything from the Miller place," she told Matthew, her voice tight with anger. "Even the medicine for their sick child." The personal nature of these attacks wasn't lost on him. John was deliberately targeting those Matthew had sworn to protect. The saloon had become a war room, its tables covered with maps marked with reported sightings and raids. Matthew studied the patterns, remembering how John had always excelled at strategy games as a boy. But this was no game. The stakes were measured in lives and futures. Through the window, he watched David, the town blacksmith, teaching women and children how to reload cartridges, their hands black with powder. The scorching afternoon sun cast long shadows across Amarillo's dusty main street as Sheriff Matthew Harris gripped his tin badge, the metal warm against his trembling fingers. His brother John's gang had surrounded the town, their Confederate gray uniforms stark against the golden prairie grass. 3 days without whiskey had left Matthew's nerves raw, but the fierce determination in his deputy Andrew Young's eyes helped steady his resolve. "They've got at least 40 men," Andrew reported, his voice low as they crouched behind overturned wagons at the edge of town. "Most of them are positioned along Miller's Ridge to the north, but I spotted another group by the Lewis Ranch." The deputy's usually immaculate shirt was stained with dust and sweat, his young face aged by the weight of their situation. The townspeople had barricaded themselves inside the church and general store, leaving the streets eerily empty. Only a handful of able-bodied men remained to defend Amarillo, including rancher David Wright and his 3 sons. Matthew couldn't shake the memory of the last time he'd faced his brother, that rainy night 5 years ago when he'd found John standing over Michael King's body, blood mixing with mud. Rebecca Lewis, the schoolteacher who'd been trying to help Matthew overcome his drinking, appeared beside them with her father's old Spencer rifle. "The women are prepared to fight if needed," she whispered, her green eyes fierce with determination. "Victoria and Hannah have organized them into groups. We won't surrender this town without a fight." Matthew felt a surge of admiration for her courage, mixed with bitter regret for all the times he'd disappointed her. A horse's whinny broke the tense silence, followed by the thunder of hooves. John Harris emerged from the heat-warped air like a demon, leading his men down the main street. His once handsome face was twisted by hatred and prison scars. "Come out and face me, brother," he bellowed, "or I'll burn this miserable town to the ground and make you watch." Matthew's hands shook as he reached for his whiskey flask, then stopped. Rebecca's gentle touch on his arm reminded him of his promise. Instead, he drew his revolver and checked the chambers. "Andrew, get the Wright boys into position on the roof of the bank. David, your men need to guard the north approach. We can't let them flank us when this starts." John's voice carried across the empty street again, mocking and cruel. "Remember what Pa always said, Matty? A man who can't protect his own blood ain't worth the air he breathes. You broke that code when you chose that badge over family. Now it's time to pay the price." Several of his men laughed, the sound echoing off the false front buildings. Grace Wright, David's wife, appeared with bandages and supplies, her face grim. "The cellar under the church is ready if we need to evacuate the children," she reported. "Abigail and the other mothers are keeping them quiet, but they're scared." Matthew nodded, knowing the weight of responsibility for every life in Amarillo rested on his next decisions. A shot rang out from the Confederate line, shattering a window above Matthew's head. He ducked as glass rained down, hearing Rebecca's sharp intake of breath beside him. The time for talk was over. John had made his choice years ago when he'd murdered Michael King in cold blood, and now Matthew had to make his, even if it meant facing his own brother in a final, deadly confrontation. The first volley from John's men set the livery stable ablaze, orange flames leaping into the afternoon sky. As smoke began to drift across the street, Matthew saw his chance. "Andrew, signal David's men to begin the counterattack. We'll use the smoke for cover." He turned to Rebecca, his voice softening. "Get to the church. If we fail, lead the women and children out through the back trail to Santa Fe." The battle erupted in earnest as the defenders opened fire from their hidden positions. John's men, expecting an easy victory, were caught off guard by the coordinated resistance. Matthew moved from cover to cover, his shots finding their marks with deadly accuracy. Years of gunfighting experience, even through an alcoholic haze, had honed his instincts. Through the chaos, Matthew caught glimpses of his brother directing the attack, John's face contorted with rage as his carefully planned revenge began to unravel. The Confederate deserters, promised easy plunder, began to waver as more of their companions fell. The defensive positions Matthew had prepared over the past 3 days were proving their worth. Rebecca's rifle cracked from an upper window of the school, dropping one of John's lieutenants from his saddle. The schoolteacher had ignored Matthew's order to evacuate, choosing instead to stand her ground. Her courage shamed him, making him fight harder to be worthy of her faith in him. The old whiskey craving faded beneath a stronger desire, the need to protect his town and its people. A bullet clipped Matthew's shoulder, spinning him against a wall. Through pain-blurred eyes, he saw John dismounting, drawing his gun for a final confrontation. "It ends here, brother," John called out, his voice carrying echoes of their shared childhood. "One way or another, I'm going to finish what I started when I killed Michael King." The truth burst from Matthew's lips as he faced his brother. "Michael was going to expose your desertion, how you led those Confederate boys to their deaths for profit. You killed him to hide your shame, and I've carried that knowledge like a stone in my gut ever since." The words hung in the smoke-filled air between them, heavy with years of unspoken accusations. John's face twisted with surprise, then darker rage. "You never understood power, Matty. This territory needs strong men willing to take what they want, not weak-willed drunks hiding behind tin stars." He raised his gun, but Matthew was already moving, diving and firing in one smooth motion. The shot took John in the chest, a look of disbelief crossing his face as he fell. The remaining Confederate deserters, seeing their leader fall, began to retreat in disarray. Andrew Young and David Wright's men pursued them to the town limits, ensuring they wouldn't regroup for another attack. Matthew knelt beside his brother's body, feeling no triumph, only a deep, aching sadness for what they'd both lost. Rebecca appeared at his side, her hand gentle on his uninjured shoulder. "You did what had to be done," she said softly. "The town is safe." Matthew nodded, rising slowly to his feet. The weight of his badge felt different now. Not a burden, but a responsibility he could finally bear with clear eyes and a steady hand. The whiskey craving had vanished, replaced by something stronger: purpose. As the dust settled over Virginia City's main street, Matthew's eyes swept across the wreckage of what had been a peaceful town just hours before. Broken windows, bullet-scarred walls, and overturned wagons bore silent witness to the ferocity of the battle. The setting sun cast long shadows through the lingering gun smoke, painting everything in shades of amber and crimson that reminded him too much of spilled blood. David Wright approached, his usually pristine shirt now stained with powder burns and dirt. "We counted 15 of them dead, including your brother," he reported quietly. "Another 8 wounded that we've got locked up in the jail. The rest scattered into the plains, but Andrew's men are keeping watch in case they try to regroup." Matthew nodded, feeling the weight of each casualty like stones in his pockets. Rebecca worked tirelessly in the makeshift infirmary they'd set up in the church, treating both townspeople and prisoners alike. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she stitched wounds and set broken bones. But Matthew could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She'd lost her father to John's gang during their first raid on the town, yet here she was, showing mercy to the very men who'd brought such violence to their doorstep. The town council gathered in the saloon, now transformed into a command center. Victoria, the owner, had cleared the tables of bottles and glasses, replacing them with maps and casualty lists. "We need to decide what to do with the prisoners," she said, her voice steady despite the bandage wrapped around her arm where a stray bullet had grazed her. "And we need to prepare in case the others come back." Matthew studied the map, tracing the likely escape routes the deserters might have taken. "They'll head for Amarillo," he said with certainty. "It's their best chance to regroup and find supplies. We need to send word ahead, warn the sheriff there." He caught his reflection in a surviving mirror behind the bar. His eyes were clear, his hand steady. The bottle of whiskey on the shelf held no appeal now. Hannah, the telegraph operator, pushed through the crowd, clutching a yellow paper. "Message from Santa Fe," she announced. "They're sending a detachment of cavalry. Should be here in 2 days." The news brought both relief and concern. Help was coming, but would it be soon enough if the deserters decided to make another attempt? As night fell, Matthew walked the perimeter with Andrew Young, checking on the men standing watch. The prairie wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, along with memories of simpler times when he and John had been boys playing at being cowboys, before the war had twisted his brother into something unrecognizable. "You know," Andrew said softly, "your brother wasn't always wrong about one thing. These lands do need strong men. He just forgot that true strength isn't about taking, it's about protecting." In the jail, Matthew faced the wounded prisoners. One of them, barely more than a boy, looked up with tears in his eyes. "Your brother promised us a new start," he said. "Said we could build something of our own out here." Matthew felt pity stir in his chest. "There's still a chance for that," he replied. "But it has to be built on something better than violence and fear." Grace, the schoolteacher, had opened her home to families who'd lost theirs in the fighting. As Matthew passed by, he could hear her reading to the children, her calm voice a reminder of the peace they were fighting to preserve. He remembered John's words about weakness and strength, understanding now that his own battle with the bottle had been part of something larger, a choice between destruction and redemption. The night deepened, and Matthew found himself back on the main street, standing where John had fallen. Rebecca joined him, carrying a lantern that pushed back the darkness. "The wounds will heal," she said, and they both knew she wasn't just talking about the injured. "The town will rebuild, and you'll be here to see it through." He reached for her hand, feeling the warmth of her fingers intertwine with his, anchoring him to this moment, to this place, to this future they would build together. In the distance, thunder rolled across the plains, promising rain to wash away the blood and dust. Matthew touched his badge, feeling its weight as a comfort now rather than a burden. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, rebuilding, healing, watching for threats on the horizon. But for the first time in years, he was ready to face them with a clear head and steady purpose, knowing that true strength lay not in the bottom of a bottle or the barrel of a gun, but in the courage to protect what matters most. Sheriff Matthew Harris stood at the window of his office in Virginia City, his hands trembling slightly as he watched the golden sunset paint the prairie grass in amber hues. 3 days sober now, the longest stretch in years. The empty whiskey bottle on his desk seemed to mock him, but he kept it there as a reminder of what he was fighting against. His deputy, Michael Young, had insisted he face this final confrontation clear-headed. Through the dusty glass, he could see Rebecca Lewis tending to her husband's grave, one of the first victims when his brother John's gang had begun terrorizing the region. The sight of her black mourning dress against the evening sky twisted something in Matthew's gut. He should have stopped John years ago, before the darkness in his brother's soul had spread like a cancer, infecting others with his peculiar brand of Confederate ideology. The town was eerily quiet now, most families having fled to Santa Fe after John's gang had burned the Wright family's ranch last week. Only the most stubborn remained, about 30 souls in all, including old David King, who'd transformed his general store into a makeshift fortress. They'd reinforced windows with steel plates, salvaged from abandoned wagons, and stockpiled enough ammunition to wage a small war. Grace Harris, Matthew's wife of 20 years, entered the office carrying a steaming cup of coffee. Her face showed the strain of recent weeks, but her eyes held that same fierce determination he'd fallen in love with back in '45. "Andrew spotted dust clouds to the south," she said quietly. "Looks like a large group. Could be them." Matthew nodded, feeling the familiar craving for whiskey surge through him. The warning bell began to toll, its deep resonance rolling across the empty streets. Matthew checked his Colt one final time, the weight of it somehow both comforting and terrifying. Through the window, he watched the remaining townspeople hurrying to their designated positions. Victoria Wright, barely 16, was helping Hannah Young distribute extra ammunition among the defenders. "They're flying that damned stars and bars," Michael reported, bursting through the door. "Must be 40 riders at least. John's leading them." The deputy's face was grim. They'd been friends once, John and Michael, before the war had twisted everything. Now Michael wore the badge of a Union Marshal, while John preached about resurrecting the Confederacy here in the Western Territories. Abigail King burst into the office, her red hair wild from running. "Sheriff, they've got Andrew. They caught him trying to warn the outlying farms." Matthew's heart sank. Andrew Lewis was just 17, Rebecca's only son. The boy had volunteered to act as an early warning system, against his mother's wishes. Now John would use him as leverage, just as he'd used hostages before. The gang arrived with the theatrical flair John had always favored, spreading out along the town's main street in a show of force. Matthew watched from the shadows as his brother rode forward. Andrew Lewis bound and slumped across his saddle. John hadn't changed much in the 5 years since his escape. Still wore that colonel's uniform he'd stolen. Still carried himself with that dangerous mix of charm and madness. "Come out, brother!" John's voice boomed across the empty street. "Let's settle this proper like gentlemen." A few of his men laughed, the sound ugly and forced. Matthew stepped onto the boardwalk, forcing himself to stand straight despite the tremors in his hands. The setting sun cast long shadows between the buildings, turning the street into a maze of light and darkness. What followed was unlike any showdown in Western legend. Instead of quick-draw heroics, Matthew Harris revealed the trump card he'd been holding. Papers proving John's gang had been selling weapons to hostile tribes, a federal offense that would bring the full might of the army down on them. The revelation sent shockwaves through John's men, many of whom were just lost souls seeking direction rather than true believers. The confrontation reached its climax not with gunfire, but with betrayal from within John's own ranks. Victoria Wright's older brother, who'd been riding with the gang, turned on John when he ordered Andrew's execution. The resulting chaos gave the townspeople their chance, and they seized it with both hands. The night erupted into pockets of violence rather than the grand battle John had envisioned. In the end, it was Grace who saved Matthew from having to kill his own brother. Her rifle shot caught John in the shoulder as he was about to put a bullet in Matthew's back, spinning him into the dust of the street he'd hoped to rule. The gang scattered, loyalty dissolving in the face of defeat, leaving their wounded leader behind like the cowards they truly were. Dawn found Matthew Harris sitting in his office, staring at that empty whiskey bottle as John's harsh breathing came from the cell behind him. The town had survived, but the cost had been high. Rebecca Lewis cradled her son's injured form, while David King organized repairs to the bullet-riddled buildings. The shadow of violence would linger, but something else remained too. The strength of a community that had faced darkness together and emerged intact. The story of Virginia City's stand against John Harris and his Confederate deserters would be told differently in different places. Some would focus on the gunfight, others on the betrayals. But for Matthew Harris, it would always be about something else. About facing his demons, both internal and external, without the numbing embrace of alcohol. About finding strength not in a bottle, but in the people who stood beside him when darkness threatened to consume their world. As the morning sun climbed higher, Matthew Harris made the decision he'd been wrestling with since dawn. He walked to John's cell, his boots echoing against the wooden floorboards. His brother lay there, pale and weak from his wound, but the hatred still burned in his eyes. "You're going back to Santa Fe prison," Matthew said quietly, "and this time you'll stay there." John's bitter laugh turned into a cough that left specks of blood on his sleeve. The town gathered as David King's men loaded the prisoner wagon. Rebecca Lewis stood at the edge of the crowd, her son's arm in a sling, watching as the man who had brought such violence to their community was led away in chains. Matthew caught her eye, seeing not judgment but understanding in her gaze. She, more than anyone, knew the weight of family bonds twisted by time and circumstance. Along the trail to Santa Fe, Matthew found himself reflecting on the path that had led him here. Each mile marker seemed to count down the years. The childhood games, the war that changed them both, the day he'd first pinned on the badge, and that terrible night he'd arrested his own brother for murder. The desert wind carried whispers of memories, but for the first time in years, Matthew felt no urge to drown them in whiskey. Victoria, the town's schoolteacher, had organized the rebuilding efforts with quiet efficiency. The bullet holes in the church were patched, the broken windows of the general store replaced. But it was the less visible repairs that meant the most. The way the townspeople now looked at their sheriff with respect instead of pity. The strength they'd found in standing together against the darkness. Hannah, the saloon owner who had once enabled Matthew's drinking, now served him coffee without comment. She'd seen the change in him during the siege, watched as he'd faced down his demons without liquid courage. The old bottle still sat on his desk, empty now and gathering dust, a reminder of battles won on multiple fronts. The news reached Virginia City 3 weeks later. John Harris had died of his wounds en route to Santa Fe. Matthew received the telegram with a strange mixture of grief and relief, reading it alone in his office as the autumn wind rattled the windows. That evening, he walked to the small cemetery on the hill, where their parents lay beneath matching stones, and added a third marker for a brother lost long before his final breath. David King's cattle operation slowly recovered from the raids, though the scars of burned fences and trampled grazing land would take seasons to heal. The rancher had offered Matthew a partnership, recognizing perhaps that a man who had faced his worst fears might make a valuable ally. But the sheriff knew his place was still behind the badge, protecting the town that had helped him find his way back to himself. As winter approached, Rebecca's son regained the use of his arm, and the boys' first act was to help Matthew organize a shooting competition for the town's youth. Teaching them to defend themselves properly, with respect for both the weapon and its consequences, became part of the sheriff's new purpose. The ghost of John's influence would not haunt another generation. Grace, the doctor's widow who had tended the wounded during the siege, began taking her evening walks past the sheriff's office. Sometimes she would bring fresh bread or stop to share news of the town. Matthew found himself looking forward to these moments, these simple connections that had once seemed impossible through the haze of alcohol and regret. The story of Virginia City's transformation spread across the territory, carried by traders and travelers who passed through. They spoke not just of the battle, but of redemption, of a town and its sheriff who had faced their demons together and emerged stronger. The empty whiskey bottle remained on Matthew's desk, not as a temptation now, but as a testament to the battles that matter most, the ones we fight within ourselves. And so Virginia City thrived, its people bound together by shared trials and triumph. Matthew Harris continued his rounds, each step steady and sure, his badge catching the sunlight like a promise kept. The plains stretched endless around them, and somewhere in that vastness, other threats might wait. But they would face them clear-eyed and united, having learned that true strength flows not from the barrel of a gun or the bottom of a bottle, but from the courage to stand together when darkness falls.